Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Pohl. I'm a reporter at WKAR. We're the NPR affiliate at Michigan State University. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm always glad to take on this kind of an assignment, especially the way this one was organized, because one 30-minute meeting last week gave me everything I needed to know to do this panel discussion today. Here's what we're going to do. We have 6 panelists I'll introduce in just a moment. I've got a couple of initial questions that I'll raise for the panel, and we're going to ask each of the 6 to respond, hoping that that will fill about the first half of our hour. The second half of the hour, we'll take questions from the floor. Some of those could be specific to only 1 or 2, I suppose, of our panelists. That's fine. And hopefully that's the way the balance of the hour will proceed, with questions from the floor. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce our panel for the Freight Rail Transportation and Economic Development Program today. Introducing from my right, your left, we have Jim Byram here. Hi, Jim. Jim is president of MABA, the Michigan Agribusiness Association. That's been a 15-year operation, and he's worked his entire career in agriculture. Jim Byram. Bruce Sutherland is vice president of MAC Incorporated. You don't say MAC, do you? It occurred to me I should ask you that. MAC Incorporated. Bruce has over 30 years in the grain industry. His company represents Michigan's largest private grain elevator company, with 8 facilities and over 40 million bushels of storage space. Dale Yates is regional manager of site design with CSX. Dale has been with CSX for 34 years, 20 of those in engineering and 14 years in industrial development. Dale is currently working with customers in developing and expanding their business opportunities. John Rickoff is president and CEO of Lake State Railway Company, with 34 years experience in the rail industry with Chicago and Northwestern, Soo Line CP Rail, the Indiana Railroad Company, and Lake State Railway. His degree is a BBA in marketing from the University of Iowa. David Close is chairperson of the Department of Supply Chain Management and MSU's Railway Management Program, with 35 years of teaching experience in logistics and transportation at MSU. He's working with the MEDC and MDOT to enhance the supply chain infrastructure for the state of Michigan. And last but not least, Libby Ogard is here. Libby's company is Prime Focus, LLC. She spent 18 years with Class I railroads and helped launch the Schneider National Intermodal Truck Rail Network, where she managed Target, Walgreens, and Home Depot supply chains. Ms. Ogard is currently working on a freight rail economic development program in Minnesota. From there, we're going to move on to our first question for the program today, and I believe we'll start with Jim and just work our way down the table. You'll pass the microphone down as needed. The first question for the panel is, why consider rail shipping? What have railroads done to improve shipper and customer experience over the last decade? Jim Byram.
Thanks, Scott. Representing the Michigan Agribusiness Association, basically everything we do is rail. We ship lots of bulk commodities, grain, distiller's grain, fertilizer inbound, and a variety of other things. Suffice to say, if we didn't have rail, we don't do business. In fact, if you see the demise of some rural grain elevators or feed mills around the state, normally those are the ones that aren't served by rail. And if you see economic development in rural Michigan, it's happening where there is rail. It's suffice to say as well that the short lines in this state are our lifeline. And I'm not just saying that because my friend John is at the other end of the table here, but without short lines providing service and interconnection to Class 1s, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. We're seeing growth in the industry. Our members are at least 90 cars or soon to be 90 car shippers, unit train shippers, both out and in. And we survive because we have solid rail access, and where we don't, we have problems. And that's really what our story is. And as we look at economic growth, as we look at more expansion of production agriculture further north in the state, that rail further north is going to become increasingly important as well. There's no question about it. Thanks.
Sutherland.
Thank you, Scott, and I also want to thank the host for today's session. It's been interesting so far. You know, not to sound arrogant, but MAC, Michigan Agricultural Commodities, is all about rail. Production in agriculture in the state continues to boom. We've doubled soybean production in the last 10 years, corn production up 40, 50%. And producers, farmers, while there's fewer of them, they're getting larger. And the growth in production demands that we handle more grain every year. For a company that has average elevator size of 5 million bushels, trucks don't get the job done. We need to ship by rail. We ship over 10,000 cars a year. We primarily ship in 90 and 75 car units, and it's imperative for us to have rail service that can move large trains quickly in and out of Michigan and down into both the processing and export markets. So for us to continue to expand our footprint, our company's growth is dependent on rail. That's why it's so critical for us. And what have railroads done to improve shipper and customer experience in the last 10 years? As Jim alluded, we are a short line dominated state. And we're impressed by the amount of money, capital that the short lines have put back into their infrastructure to improve their rail systems in order to handle these larger grain trains. The CSX, Dale's Group, NS have not demanded, but have certainly encouraged us to ship larger grain trains. And so we need the infrastructure improvements in order to do that, and we're seeing that, and I thank the short lines for that.
Dale Gates of CSX.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. I think from the Class 1 perspective, it begins with the customer. So it's already been alluded by Bruce, and is that we want to work with the customer to try to find out what their needs are and determine the things that is on their mind that we can work to make it better. One of the things we've done, like with a lot of our grain shippers, is we've worked with them to expand their operations to handle the larger trains, to make the trains bigger, more efficient, improve their switching services, and working with them on that. So there's a lot of things that we're working with. We're continually in meeting with the customers. We're continually working with them. We have a team of people that's basically all that they do. And then we all come together to work and to try to make this experience better. One of the things we try to do is make sure the customer understands the benefit of rail, that less congestion, better environment, all of the various things that are attuned to rail. We want to make sure that they understand that. And so we're continually meeting with them, continually working with the customers to make this better.
John Rickoff.
Again, there we go. Thank you for the invite. I've always enjoyed my opportunity to get up and talk about our industry. In the 34 years that I've been in the industry, there's never been a better time to utilize rail. We, as an industry, continue to get better all the time. Our focus at Lake State Railway is to improve and to be the service carrier of excellence in our area so that we can continue to show our customers that they do want to do more business with us. The influx of grain has really allowed me to bring up a terminology from old, and anybody that's been around the industry as long as I have probably have heard the reference to Granger railroads. That was up very big in the Midwest, and I'd like to think that Lake State is actually a Granger railroad with over 50% of the product that we move is all related to the ag industry. So we're very thankful to people like MAC, Auburn Bean and Grain, Gavilon, and I can go on and on and on, that they are working to increase and improve their facilities so that we can do together a better job servicing the state and doing what the governor's asked. The governor has pointed out that this industry, the ag industry, is the second largest area in the state, and it's a growing area, rapidly growing area. Thanks to Jim Byram, I've been educated on that. And we are doing everything we can at Lake State to improve so that we can be there in the support role that we play to help that industry grow as well as grow ourselves. Thank you.
David Close.
Michigan State's supply chain program and the supply chain programs of the other universities around the state produce a lot of supply chain talent. Those are the people that manage firms in terms of transportation, manufacturing, purchasing, inventory management, and so on. The role that they end up going out into industry, both around the state and around the country, is what I call shippers, the people that make decisions regarding freight. And one of the choices they have is using railroads. And the opportunity in Michigan, particularly with the ag industry, but also with the auto industry, is to use rail as an alternative to truck in a way to reduce cost and enhance sustainability of shipping or moving product. Some of the challenges they face are to move product globally. I mean, with all the agricultural products we produce in the state, how do we get them out effectively into global ports without, while getting around the congestion and minimizing any risk and uncertainty? As I talk to supply chain managers of many of the major companies around the country, two of the major dimensions they're trying to focus on is reducing risk and uncertainty in the supply chain, meaning take out inventory, take out delays, take out cases where the product could get lost, or minimize the risk that a plant could get shut down for lack of raw material. All those are the challenges supply chain managers are facing today, and the challenge for the rail industry is obviously they're positioned very well on a cost point of view. The challenge is to make sure they can also deliver on the minimizing the risk and uncertainty and congestion point of view. And they made tremendous inroads on it. I think railroads have done tremendous amount in reducing lane uncertainty for specific lanes, focusing their efforts on key infrastructure points where they can take out the delays or minimize the delays so we can take out inventory in the supply chain, which is a critical part. So I think that's the best part of the story, but I think we need to continue making progress in that particular dimension.
Libby Ogard of Prime Focus.
Thank you so much. Derek Leathers, who is the CEO of Warner Enterprise, is running a commercial spotlight right now that talks about the fact that in order to deliver the North American commerce, it takes a little bit more than 3 million truck drivers per day. And so from that perspective, we are faced with a demographic challenge that the average age of truck drivers is about 58 years old. And so from that perspective, we're facing kind of an impending crisis of who's going to be the next truck driver that's going to deliver your freight from door to door. The second thing that we are involved with is kind of a regulatory environment that's really focusing on truck capacity as well as the truck safety area. So July 1st, the new hours of service rule went into effect. It's estimated that that's going to equate to about a loss of approximately 60,000 drivers from a productivity standpoint. And I'd like to highlight a corridor between Chicago and Houston. It's roughly 1,000 miles. Based on AAA or MapQuest, it should take about 18 hours and 6 minutes. And based on the new hours of service, all it's going to take is one weather delay, one detour, one road construction project, or an accident, and that driver is now not going to be compliant within that 1,000-mile length of haul. This is a tremendous opportunity for railroads, whether it's carload or intermodal, and an opportunity to play even a larger role in the future. And we're seeing substantial development and investment on behalf of the Class 1 railroads in terms of inland ports as well as intermodal terminals. Some of the improvements that the rails have made, and one that I'm particularly interested in and watching, is the fact that many Class 1s are now including station codes for short-line railroads, which enables those going on the website for the Class 1s the ability to look at routes and trip plans that connect Class 1 origins or destinations to the short line network.
We're on schedule. Very nice job, all of you. Let's move on to our second question. And Jim, we'll start with you again, if you don't mind. The second question, we want to talk about intermodal, which is clearly a growth area. How can rail provide more effective and reliable intermodal services into and out of Michigan? Jim Byram.
Intermodal is tough for agriculture further north in the state. Getting containers north and the right containers positioned in a proper location is very, very difficult, especially when one looks at the Food Safety Modernization Act and hands required or hands that touch a shipment or hands that touch a commodity it moves to market is going to be even tougher, especially as you look at food items being shipped. And most of what would move intermodally from the central part of the state or the northern part of the state would either be dry beans, edible soybeans, fruit crops, things like that. The Food Safety Modernization Act is a huge issue, making sure that the right containers are in the right place. It's going to be tough to have a container system, I think, in Mount Pleasant or Alma or somewhere up there that could interface with those proper containers. But there are tremendous opportunities out here as well that aren't necessarily intermodal. And I have to highlight the number. Currently, we identify $500 million that our members are spending on enhancing infrastructure in the state right now. The irony is most of that's dedicated toward unit train shippers and new facilities that can facilitate unit trains.
Thank you, Scott. Well, as Jim mentioned, for large bulk handling facilities like our own, 20 and 40-foot containers really aren't conducive to moving a lot of grain. But the way they do help is diversify our grain portfolio. We do handle specialty soybeans, non-GMO soybeans that go into Southeast Asia. We're into edible soybeans or edible beans as well. So it does allow us to participate in that marketplace, but on a very small scale. And it's a niche type of business. Michigan really isn't conducive to large container movements up and down the state, obviously being a peninsula. We're out of that corridor, that 80-90 corridor, Chicago, Columbus, those areas that really see the heaviest amount of container traffic. Plus, we're seeing millions of dollars invested in container loaders in Chicago. There's probably, 4 or 5 companies alone loading containers for grain, primarily soybeans and wheat, very little corn. Of course, DDGs are a big export item in containers. So we see it more as a specialty item for our company, and I think for most of Michigan's big or larger grain facilities.
Yates of CSX.
Intermodal provides a great opportunity, and it's a good, viable opportunity for those that don't have rail access. We have, as well as NS, has a intermodal terminal in Detroit, and it gives us connectivity to the port. So the shippers from the overseas, from the various commodities that will travel internationally, it allows us to be able to connect with them and get to the ports and get these containers in and out to the customer as they've been designated. Michigan does, as mentioned, as Bruce mentioned, it kind of being a peninsula, it is a little bit out of the route, but we do have a lot of opportunity that can allow for the shipment of the goods that's there. The intermodal, once they get it landed in there into the terminal, the other thing, and then the other side of the coin that I think that needs to be looked at too, is that how is the roadway system to be able to get that container or to get that truck trailer over to the appropriate customer in that situation. So that's another side of the coin that has to be looked at as well.
Rick Off of Lake State Railway.
The intermodal idea is a great one. It's just a very challenging subject. We've looked at it from our aspect. We're very interested in it. It goes obviously way beyond the grain side. Dow Corning are great examples of people that are doing stuff with that, probably auto parts, all kinds of different products. The challenge that we have is trying to figure out how we can consolidate intermodal in a place that it can be taken to the Class 1 carriers, and they're going to want to take it in the fashion that we can get it to them, which is probably less than train load, certainly for starters, and then reclassify it and get it on the appropriate trains, whether it's going west or east. It's a big challenge. We will continue to work on that. We'll continue to look at that. I know there's been some people that have proposed building an intermodal facility, as an example, in Flint. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I have seen another state, and I won't go there with that, but they built an intermodal facility and thought that, the business will come. It didn't. It failed miserably. So I think it takes a lot. It's going to take a lot of input from a lot of people to try to develop a system that can allow intermodal to move from whether it's the Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula, down to an east-west system where the intermodal wants to move. Getting the empty containers in position is a whole nother challenge. So the concept is great. The volume probably exists if you can aggregate it all, and the challenge will be putting together a system in cooperation with whatever Class 1 carrier to try to get the east-west movement to work in conjunction with the short-haul north-south move. Thank you.
Close of MSU.
We work with many of the companies that have been mentioned, but moving beyond ag, it gets into the more of the process companies, the Dow Corning, as well as Myers, Kellogg, Amway, and Steelcase. And those firms have designed their supply chains, for the most part, with the idea of $2 a gallon fuel. And now we're at $4 a gallon fuel, which dramatically changes the economics of their supply chain. And they need to, and they're all looking at the idea of how do we use intermodal as an opportunity to change it. I reflect back and I tell my students that over my career at Michigan State, I think I've been through Kellogg distribution centers probably 10 or so times. And I look at the Kellogg distribution center in Kalamazoo, or in Battle Creek, and when I first went there, they showed me their rail dock, and when I went there the next time, the rail dock was filled in. And the last time I went there, they were digging the rail dock back out. And it just sort of reflects that even companies that are not in bulk products are looking as a way to get back into rail, either in a carload environment or certainly in an intermodal environment. And as we talk to the companies in Grand Rapids, they're crying for a way to get product moved on an alternative to truck, just because of that difference in costs. And we don't see those fuel costs declining in the short run or in the long run either. So people are saying, how do you redesign the supply chain with that context there? And rail becomes a key part of the equation.
Ilgard of Prime Focus.
I'm going to start off with saying I think we need a new word for intermodal because there's basically several types of different intermodal networks. So the first network that I'd like to talk about is the domestic network that's really driven time sensitive and by large volumes and density. So what we're looking at is full train loads moving with a level of service that's usually truck plus 1 day. Then there's also the international intermodal, which tends to have slightly more time within its supply chain. And its challenge is I only need to be sure that I make that vessel cutoff that might sail once a week from the coast. So we have different characteristics within each intermodal network. And I think it's important that we recognize fundamentally the way that we look at those. The Intermodal Association of North America had its annual maintenance meeting in May this year in Chicago. And one of the panels that talked about intermodal was the kind of new types of intermodal that are coming on in more rural areas, and some of them actually served by short lines. And that may be an opportunity for Michigan. Those examples include Decatur, Illinois. This is an intermodal terminal that's being put together by a large agricultural shipper. Chippewa Falls, which is, again, focused at international exports, put together by the Canadian National. And then Lewiston, Auburn, Maine, and several other short line examples also exist. So recognize that intermodal is all about networks, and it's also about time-sensitive freight.
All right, we're doing great on time, everybody, so we've got plenty of time for your questions. Feel free to ask follow-up questions, individual questions of members of the panel. We're open to questions from the floor now. Anyone? Don't be shy. Okay, we're going to bring a microphone to you.
How is the pressure for short line railroads? How is the pressure to produce train load shipments? How is that affecting short line railroads? Are you able to do that, or do you still have a lot of single cars, or what?
In regards to train load, the pressure is really not that great. If you look at our system, we probably move, should have this number on top of my head, but well more than 50% of our business in train load quantities. We are able to aggregate some segments to, in other words, add cars together to build train loads. We double up train loads. People in Saginaw may not like to hear me say this, but we do run as big as 160 car trains south out of Saginaw to interchange with CSX and Flint. It's really not that difficult. It's just part of our business. It's a part of our business that's been around for many, many, many years. And either you play in the game or you don't. And it's for us, it's very efficient to play in the game.
Just want to chime in on that one? Panel? Okay, next question. Here's one up.
I guess this is for, well, I guess anybody can answer to that, but I've been kind of looking at this over the past 10, 15 years, and there seems to be these trends that always are going on what's happening on the rail development. And 10, 15 years ago, it was the development of all these new major, huge intermodal facilities, the Joliets and some of the other ones. And now it seems to be starting to look into some of the smaller, maybe intermodal or smaller transloads. Or I mean, when you look to your crystal ball, where do you think is going to be the next big trend of development when it comes to either class ones or short lines or in general the EDCs, looking into what are we developing next and where's the market push going to be next on the rail side?
Who's going to take that? Libby, were you asking for? Yeah, Libby Ogard.
One of the things that I think is an emerging trend is talking about transloads. And when I think about the Class 1 developments, right now they've put a lot of money in the inland intermodal terminals as well as these large inland ports. But there's an awful lot of rural America that is not connected to those inland intermodal ports. And some of the examples that I've been digging up is many of the short lines were spun off. And when they were spun off from the Class 1 railroads, they didn't have property that accompanied them. So right now there's a lot of interest in teaming up with economic development agencies as well as with port authorities to look at setting up transloads or nodes by which customers who may be 5 miles or 10 miles or 50 miles away from the railroad track can have access to the railroad track. One example is in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Southern went on an investment program and built 5 different transloads and has increased the volume on their short line network by over 11%. I've heard also stories, and this isn't at a time when the economy was going at a pace of 2 to 3%. So if you think about that, that's a substantial difference in pace. I've heard other examples where some short lines have increased their revenue throughput by more than 100% because they've been able to access more customers. But being able to make these transloads work is usually a community effort. It's an effort between not only the short line, possibly the DOT in terms of funding or maybe freight rail assistance or freight rail preservation, as well as economic development, as well as the community users in the region. So I think that this is an opportunity that allows those that don't have access today to access the railroad. With that, I'm going to say that another trend that I see is that a lot of the folks who have traditionally managed rail programs within their companies are at a point where they're retiring. And we do not have a lot of freight transportation management education programs that are training leaders of the future to learn how to use rail, to understand what demurrage or car hire or switching fees or any of these other things that kind of go together with that. We come from the past decade of a lot of freight optimization networks that uses a black box solution to essentially help you identify site location. And a lot of those models don't have the capability of assessing a rail transportation network because of all of the uniquenesses of, do I have a rail siding? What's the cost? What's the service? So I think those are two small trends.
Jim Byram.
Libby mentioned transload, and our association has been a strong advocate for a comprehensive transportation solution in Michigan. Just spending money on roads doesn't solve it. We need a solid road, rail, and we also need a water infrastructure. And we believe that a comprehensive system that allows transload and a whole variety of other things certainly would aid not just short lines and class ones, but also help boost economic development. You know, we can grow an awful lot of things here agriculturally. Our markets are determined by how inexpensively and how consistently and how rapidly we can get the product to market. So we need a comprehensive solution first. And, you know, I look at some of the port facilities in Michigan that are falling in disrepair or have fallen in disrepair, and it kind of reminds me of rail infrastructure 20 years ago. And we need to make sure that we don't lose that whole transload intermodal, I guess that's intermodal as well, but lose that whole consistent transportation system. If we lose that from a freight perspective, we will lose markets. And if we want to increase exports, we're going to have to load it on water.
John Rickoff of Lake State Railway.
I'm with Libby. I believe that transloading has a very bright future. It's a difficult subject from the standpoint that, again, somebody's got to make an initial investment. Whether that investment should be made by the rail company or individuals or corporations, that's yet to be seen. It does take a fair amount of volume to make it viable. We, you know, right now are in the middle of contemplating what do we do with the newfound grain sources up in the Alpena, Michigan area. You know, they're trucking it well over 100 miles to get it to the first elevator. In fact, the first new elevator built anywhere even close is in Standish, and it's under construction. Well, the elevator itself is done. The track will be completed in time for this shipping season. The track's under construction as we speak. But we look at it and say, we want to put it in rail in Alpena. Well, nobody's going to go up there and build, we don't think, Jim. We don't think anybody's going to go build a brand new elevator like Auburn Bean and Grain did in Standish and Alpena, not anytime soon. So what can we do to put the grain in there and move it down to one of the bigger elevators to aggregate it, to ship it out bound from there? Whether that should be an individual company that does that, whether the railroad should do that, there's many factors that come into play there, which makes it a little more difficult. Very easy concept to understand, but when you're talking about grain that may come in at high moisture, now we're going to put it in a covered hopper, and how fast do we have to have it out of that covered hopper before we got a problem? All of those factors have to be considered. I guarantee you we're going to do everything on our part to figure out how we do that. I've included talking to them about loading it in open-top hoppers. I mean, if it's not going to rain, and we know it's not going to rain for a while, who cares? It's not uncommon. It moves around in an open trailer many times on the farm. So from the farm to an elevator it does in some cases, not always, but we would like to have the opportunity to figure out how to do that, and we're, again, giving Jim a lot of credit today, but and that's a good thing. But he is really, and his organization has done the legwork to point out that there is a whole new element to this business that we need as a transportation entity, a rail transportation entity, to find that solution to help them continue that trend and continue that growth. Lots of other commodities. We've got people talking about wood pellets to go to Europe. Everybody knows the northern half of the Upper Peninsula has been a wood source forever, and with many of the mills having closed and stuff, there's a lot of that can now be shifted to another type of project, and we'd love to be helpful in that as well.
Neil Yates, CSX.
Just real quickly, I think one of the things to note as well is most of the Class 1s have been developing the offload sites, if you will, throughout the area, understanding that a lot of times customers are not located next to a rail line. So there's been a lot of development over the years, and it's really starting to get to the point where not only new systems or new facilities are being developed, but also the ones that are in place are being fine-tuned. Years ago, first development, it used to be just bulk unloading, whether it be grain or flour or salt or some bulk unloading material. Now we're starting to see a lot of innovation where other commodities are being handled in these facilities, so that, and a lot of creativity where it's just not restricted to a certain area. So there's a lot of continued development going on in that.
Anyone else? David? David Close?
Building on a comment that Libby made, there's going to be a real shortage of supply chain talent in the next 5 or 6 years. The work of a colleague of mine at Michigan State with the Supply Chain Talent Academic Initiative indicates that in the next 5 to 7 years, the demand for supply chain talent will outpace the supply by a 6-to-1 ratio. And that really is reflecting not only for the shippers, the people that move product, but also for the carriers, the motor carriers and the rail industry. And you're going to see a significant increase in demand for people that can look at an integrated supply chain from the field to the table and figure out where the best investments in terms of assets, infrastructure, and decisions in terms of movement should be applied.
All right. Next question, please.
Two questions, one for David. The Coyote Logistics or whoever just announced last week they're putting 125 jobs, I believe, in Ann Arbor. Do you have any insight as to whether this is automotive related or is part of the supply chain management, I would assume, but any insight you can share?
Yeah, that was an interesting discussion. The executive vice president was a former student, and I had him in class last week because he's also a current student. They do primarily freight brokerage. A lot of it is automotive related. Part of the reason that they made the choice to put it in this region is, as I said earlier, we have a lot of supply chain talent that came out of not just the Michigan State program, but the Western program, the Tech program, the Central program, the Wayne State program, Grand Valley. I mean, they all have supply chain programs that came out because of faculty at Michigan State. And so we have a lot of students that maybe earlier in their career they want to move outside Michigan, some of them want to come back. And they're really reflecting that there's a big talent pool here. Why not go for it?
Thank you. The other question I had is for Bruce or Jim. The southern and eastern ports are falling all over themselves to deepen their drafts and what have you in anticipation for the Econimc, ships that are going to go through the expanded Panama Canal. Is there anything within the the agricultural interest that has observed or made some decisions as to what happens from the standpoint of the logistics when this occurs, if it occurs? I mean, the Western ports are clearly not going to give it up without a battle to remain competitive. But I'm just interested if there's anything agriculturally that it might portend for Michigan.
Well, it's interesting. The grain trains that ship out of Michigan typically aren't really going for export. They're going into the southeast poultry and hog markets. That's what the lion's share of corn goes. Soybeans go into the processing market as well. ADM Valdosta, Purdue at Norfolk, which both process and exports. But most of the grain that's shipped out of Michigan, both soybeans and corn, is processed within the United States. That's true for wheat. Over half of our wheat, almost 3/4 of our wheat, stays in the state of Michigan, processed in state. So from that standpoint, we're not seeing that impact. But what's going to be interesting is, I think, as exporters develop larger needs, especially in the Panamax and servicing Asia and other continents that have increasing demand, it's probably going to start to tax infrastructure to a certain extent initially. But I think, we do still have excess capacity within our own infrastructure to keep moving trains to these ports. The ports have to ramp up and be able to handle the additional grain required to load those types of vessels. In fact, Norfolk is looking at doing that and increasing their facilities in order to meet those needs.
We did a project a year ago where we looked out to 2025. In Michigan, we forecast is going to increase grain production, corn, soybeans, wheat, potentially as much as moving from 2010 levels of about 500 million bushels of grain by 2025 to perhaps as much as 900 million bushels of grain. That's going to be because of added land, things like that. And I don't want to get into the discussion of climate change, but trust me, it's happening. We're seeing the production area move further north. We're seeing acres come back in production, no question about it. We're seeing acres that are going to be growing commodities that historically haven't. That's what John was talking about, the Alpena story. We're actually seeing a development potentially in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Long explanation to lead to the issue of we are probably going to have to look at export. We're probably going to have to look at moving stuff more effectively for international markets. That's going to involve a whole lot of things in this state. It'll involve more short line infrastructure, of course, because we're short line driven. It'll involve more intersection or interconnect with Class 1s. And of course, Class 1s determine an awful lot of where that grain moves with rates and systems and structure. And as that happens, and as Michigan continues to expand, and if you consider what we're calling now, or many companies are calling the Upper Midwest expansion, we're going to see a dramatic infrastructure need to handle fertilizer inbound to some of those new acres, as well as grain outbound. And if you don't believe me, that's okay, but I will just suggest that Monsanto just dedicated $100 million for corn variety development in the western provinces of Canada. That tells me that others are looking at this as well, so it is happening. John's going to be challenged to figure out how to move grain south out of some of those northern climes, and we are going to have to move grain probably out of Michigan to export markets, and the Panamix may certainly make sense. There were an awful lot of soybeans, for example, that went out of here this year to the Gulf to be exported. So there's opportunity on the horizon if all this comes together.
Libby would like in on this, it looks. David, please. Libby Yogard.
One of the items that I'd like to bring up is that I think as there is more interest in rail shipping, there also needs to be a mechanism by which to identify sites that are available for freight rail economic development. So if I think about this, I can think about how, if I am a shipper and I'm looking for a freight rail economic development site, where is my inventory list? Okay, so certainly you can go to the Class 1s. You can identify some of those you could call their property management, real estate development folks. They have a listing. It may not be a complete listing. Many of the short lines do not list properties on their websites. Some of them do. Some economic development agencies within the state, I know, for example, Wisconsin and 39 states use a program called Prospector, which allows you to go in and identify either counties, population areas, or whatever, and you can search on a rail feature. So if the site has access to rail, you can search on it. It's only as good as your local agencies are in terms of identifying the inventory that they have available. The other thing that I found is that when you go to industrial real estate people, they have often their own networks that list rail-served properties. So in some respects, what we're doing is creating sort of a rat's nest that there's no single location to identify where available sites might be, and it requires that you look at multiple channels. So states that are very interested in promoting freight rail economic development might be interested in trying to improve that visibility of available properties.
Anyone else? Time for one more, do you think? One more question? Or one or two, maybe.
Real quick.
Okay.
You guys kind of danced around this a little bit in the previous question. What happens if the Mississippi River becomes a lot less reliable, whether it's climate change or whatever else? What does that mean both for the state and nationally?
Bill, you must have read the same article this morning I did, because the Mississippi is not as navigable, the system is not as navigable as it was, especially the tributary rivers. What that's going to mean is a whole lot more trains, no question about it. The broader issue is many of the parts of the country that are served by some of those tributaries to the Mississippi also are facing severe water stress. And as those areas face severe water stress, production will move. Grain production will move in the country, and I think it's moving this direction. As we look at dairy production, for example, it's moving back where water is. As we look at grain production, it's going to move where water is. We're seeing that happen in agriculture at an aggressive pace, and as water becomes more of a challenge, it's only going to mean better things for Michigan. I think we have, 60 or 70% of the world's fresh water within about 150 miles of where we're sitting today. It's a resource. We need to recognize it and use it and make sure that it's part of what we use for economic development.
Another question?
Thanks. I'm putting on my Freight Advisory Committee hat now. I'd like a thought from everybody on what I need to know as a member of that committee as we try and struggle with how to put together a national freight plan or recommendations for the U.S. DOT. Policies, programs, funding, whatever.
You wanted a response from everyone? Is that what you said?
It'd be good to have
Just
it,
want to make
yeah.
sure I understand.
You didn't see
Jim
my
Byron.
bullet points, did you? I'll give you my 3 bullet points. A comprehensive freight strategy that needs to involve all modes of transportation, no question about it. Second, we need to rebuild especially lines that can't handle heavy cars, especially on short lines, because we're going to be moving heavy cars and they're going to be unit trains, and we have to upgrade those and trestles and the infrastructure. And then third and finally, as we look at the future, we absolutely, at least in Michigan, need to consider rebuilding some of those lines that were either torn out or abandoned. Because if we rebuilt some of those lines, I'll cite Riga to Ottawa Lake. We can talk about Brown City to Port Huron. Some of those lines that were cul-de-saced, if they rebuilt, that would create opportunities for transportation, rail transportation, we can't even begin to imagine. And those are the opportunities that are out there in every state where that unfortunate situation occurred.
Well, I think to emphasize that tie-in between the short lines and the Class 1 is very important. And when you have larger short lines, some of the larger holding companies like the Genesee and Wyoming or Watco, they can afford to use their own money for infrastructure and keep their tie-ins with the Class 1s. But some smaller ones in the state may be maxed out on what they can do. Maybe they've put up the collateral they can for infrastructure renewal and need that assistance. And I think making sure that we look at all scales on the short lines from their size and tie into Class 1s is very important, especially for the state of Michigan, because the Class 1s are our outlet, they're our lifeline, and we have to make sure the short lines and the Class 1s continue to tie in well and handle the freight that's required.
Dovetailing on what Bruce said is I think the same thing is that access to funding, I think, is a critical thing, not only for the railroads and for the short lines, but also for the customers themselves, that a lot of times when they're looking to build a new facility, they're going to be asked to invest a lot of money to be able to do this. And they have an ROI, they have a need to make this capital work. And a lot of times with some of your smaller customers, that just is not available for them. So I think one of the key takeaways would be the access to funding and the programs for both the railroads and the customers.
John Rickoff?
I think part of the policy has to recognize that everybody needs a fair shake. So all players in the industry need a fair shake. For me to sit here and, I want to bash trucking, but, in the state of Michigan with the highest truck weights in the nation, it makes it somewhat difficult for us. And we have a lot of investments to make. One of the investment areas, back to Jim again, this Alpena area, our line is only rated for 263,000 pounds. We dearly would love it to be 286,000. It's probably in excess of a $20 million fix from our part. And we're a $20 million a year company. We already spend at the level that Class 1s spend on our capital programs and the same percentage level, just trying to maintain and get ahead with what we can. We dearly want to bring ourselves up to 286, but that's a difficult thing. The second part I would say is, the recognition that the U.S. highway system can't handle the growth. And there is no way, in my opinion, that we'll ever come up with the money to build the highway system to handle the projected growth. I don't think that's a reasonable thought. So I think they're going to have to our government's going to have to decide that we can help the freight rail systems, and we've been our own worst enemy, in a way, for many years. We didn't want that help. We chose to go a route that we were going to invest in our own infrastructure for all these years to prove that we could do it on our own. We did that, but now we're at a point where the nation needs us more than ever. I'm maybe being a little pompous about that, but the reality is there. From an efficiency standpoint, from an energy standpoint, from an environment standpoint, the nation needs us, and they need to recognize us as part of that overall game, whether it's highway system, waterways, you name it. We're all in it together. We are also partners with all of those people. While we're competitors, we're partners. And, as much as I can talk about truckers and what they do, without them, I wouldn't have a lot of the business I have. We talked about transload earlier. Well, guess what? We bring in product from thousands of miles away, and guess where it goes? It goes into a truck for final delivery. So that it's all needed to tie together. You got a difficult job ahead of you, but hopefully we can help with some of that. Thank you.
David Close.
Building on just what John just said, I think the transportation policy is still highly modal-centric. And if you look at it from the shipper's perspective, they don't really care. They're looking for a solution. So I think a strong focus has to be put on intermodal and looking at it from the way the shippers think of it, which is how do I move it from A to B and don't care really about how do I move from A to B most efficiently and effectively and don't really care about the mode that it moves on. So more of the decisions, I think, have to take that perspective, and more of the investments in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the policies and the support, need to take that perspective.
Bogard.
I'd like to start off by saying that freight seeks the path of least resistance. Governments can influence mode choice or can provide incentives for one mode or another, yet it's ultimately the customer that makes the decision based on what's appropriate for their supply chain. So I would look at incentives targeted at users or shippers and give them an incentive or a tax credit for as much freight as they can convert to an intermodal network if that's in fact, and I'm going to use the word intermodal loosely, so truck, rail, truck, ship, rail, container, etc. The second point that I'd like to talk about is that reliable networks are important. That when we have a lack of reliability, it increases not only our labor costs, it increases our inventories, and it increases our whole supply chain costs. And so we are competing in a global network. And if we have waste within our transportation system, that ultimately impacts the cost of our total delivered goods. So we need to be focused on how do we have a reliable network that's not going to be 15 minutes one day and an hour and 15 minutes the next day. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is things like the Jones Act, harbor maintenance tax, cabotage, and all of the things that we have laid upon our transportation network that sort of don't you dare, or these are the rules that you must abide by with which to compete, which ultimately impacts productivity and capacity. We're at a time that we are not going to be able to meet the growth needs for freight in the future from a highway system, so it's time to look at those policies and see if they are policies for the 21st century. The last thing that I'd like to say is think big. None of these projects are small. And many of our state preservation programs or our state plans might have money, $200,000, $250,000, some level, but that's not big enough. I mean, that barely covers a switch. And when we're talking about large inland ports or intermodal facilities, we're talking $10, $20 million for some of the small ones. And if we're looking at some of the big ones, $100 million. And Nobody has that kind of a checkbook. So think big and think about collaborative infrastructure development that includes not only economic development, site selection, have the user involved, as well as government types of programs. Thanks.
Libby Ogard, David Close, John Rickoff, Dale Yates, Bruce Sutherland, and Jim Byram, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. Thanks for good questions from the floor.